the silence of night shattered by an act of sabotage that screams intentionality. This is not some border skirmish. This is a direct hit on critical infrastructure deep inside a NATO member state. We are tracking reports confirming that an explosives charge detonated along a key rail line in northeastern Poland, disrupting transport that is vital not just for Polish domestic logistics, but critically for the movement of NATO supplies eastward. This is an extraordinary and dangerous development, elevating the shadow war between Russia and the West out of the gray zone and into stark visibility. Poland didn't wait for the usual diplomatic fog to clear. Warsaw's Ministry of Internal Affairs, in a move of stunning geopolitical gravity, didn't blink. They pointed the finger directly at the Kremlin. This is not speculation. This is Warsaw's direct accusation of state-sponsored terrorism aimed at crippling Poland's logistical backbone. The official statement delivered just hours ago declared that this act, quote, bears the signature of Russian intelligence services seeking to sow chaos and paralyze the flow of defense material. The target selection is everything. Why this specific rail line? Experts are confirming that while commercial traffic was certainly affected, the primary intent seems to have been maximizing disruption to military supply corridors, the very arteries that sustain the defense effort on the continent's eastern flank. If these lines were carrying material destined to support Ukraine's defense, or if the intent was to interfere with the staging of NATO forces near the increasingly tense Suwalki Gap, the geopolitical stakes skyrocket. This attack sends immediate shock waves across the continent. It's a message delivered with the raw force of political will. Your logistical security, even far from the front lines, is an illusion. Moscow predictably fired back, dismissing the Polish claims as hysterical Russophobia. Furthermore, the Kremlin immediately turned its anger directly toward the United States, suggesting that NATO itself staged the event as a cynical pretext for demanding further military buildup and justifying future sanctions. But the damage is done. The rhetoric is beginning to harden into posture. Every word spoken now by ambassadors and ministers is dangerous, pushing us dangerously toward escalation. Consider the implication. Damaging a rail line carrying potentially high-value Russian military asset countermeasures, or just the capacity to transport essential heavy weaponry. While initial reports suggest the physical damage was immediately reparable, the psychological effect, the realization that these attacks are now normalized inside NATO territory, constitutes meaningful operational damage to deterrence theory itself. Warsaw views this as an unusually blunt threat. This is where Poland draws a rhetorical red line. The official word is clear and resonating throughout Brussels. Poland will not be intimidated. This demands a resolute response, one that goes far beyond mere repairs and sternly worded condemnations. We are entering a phase where conventional sabotage is merging violently with state-level political confrontation. If Russia is confirmed to be expanding this conflict onto NATO soil through non-kinetic but destructive means, then the internal debate inside Brussels instantly shifts from defensive hardening to examining expanded retaliation options. We are watching the potential for diplomatic disaster transform into a pre-war confrontation. The language coming out of NATO capitals suggests we are already past simple deterrence. We are now dealing with perceived aggression that must be met with force, rhetorical force today, but the military options are being carefully calibrated right now. The question is no longer whether Moscow would target logistics inside NATO, but rather, how far NATO is willing to go to protect its critical infrastructure now that the breach has occurred. This rail line blast isn't just a physical breach. It is a profound rupture in the fragile peace of Eastern Europe, forcing leaders to confront the reality of expanding this conflict into a wider regional security crisis. The stakes have never been higher. The immediate aftermath of the blast has provided critical intelligence. Forensic teams, working under unprecedented pressure near the Polish-Ukrainian frontier, are confirming the use of military-grade explosives. Not the crude improvised devices typical of local unrest, but charges designed for maximum structural failure. This wasn't vandalism. This was precision sabotage aimed at a critical choke point. Operational analysis reveals precisely why this track was hit. For months, this particular stretch of rail has served as an essential artery for Russian logistics, ferrying crucial supplies, heavy equipment, and possibly even ballistic missile components across occupied territory and into staging areas. It was, in short, a high-value Russian military asset pathway. The blast achieved meaningful operational damage, forcing an immediate, costly halt to heavy armor movement. The strategic significance is undeniable. Someone executed a high-risk operation deep behind the lines to choke the logistical lifeline of the Russian military machine. And here is where the physical detonation gives way to the verbal detonation. Poland, facing the immediate security threat on its sovereign territory, didn't hedge its bets. Warsaw's response was swift, accusing Russian special services directly of orchestrating this act of aggression, labeling it an attempt to sow panic and test NATO resolve. This accusation immediately sent shock waves across global capitals. The reaction from Moscow was immediate, defensive, and truly extraordinary and dangerous. While denying involvement in the blast, the Kremlin didn't stop there. Instead, it instantly turned its anger directly toward the United States and the wider NATO alliance, claiming this accusation was a fabrication designed to justify what Moscow calls provocative expansionism. This is the language of pre-conflict. But Washington and Warsaw didn't blink. They fired back, framing Moscow's denial as a transparent lie and its counter-accusation as evidence that the Kremlin is rapidly losing control over its own escalating shadow war. We are watching the raw force of political will clash in real time. Each diplomatic statement is not a conversation. It is a punch designed to leave a mark. The rhetoric is rapidly beginning to harden into posture. Diplomatic channels are screaming alarm bells, warning that the smallest miscalculation now moves the world dangerously toward escalation. Yesterday's protest note is today's declaration of intent. Russia, in a statement released just hours ago, issued an unusually blunt threat, stating that any nation attempting to directly interfere with Russian logistics or infrastructure, regardless of location, would be viewed as an active belligerent. This defines a red line, a desperate attempt to assert boundaries while under pressure. The stakes are clear. If Poland or NATO yields, they validate Russia's aggressive tactics. If they push back, they risk fulfilling the narrative of expanding this conflict. Poland's prime minister, in a fiery midnight address, made it clear: "We will not be intimidated." That declaration demands a resolute response, not just from Warsaw, but from every signatory of the NATO Charter. The fear is that this direct attack on logistics will push the conflict outside of the current geographic restraints. Military analysts are now discussing expanded retaliation options. What might the West do to signal that attacks on critical infrastructure will meet a response in kind? Do those options include deep penetration cyber strikes against Russian infrastructure? Economic strangulation unprecedented in scope? Or something kinetic that forces Moscow to reconsider its calculus? The explosion on the rail line has fundamentally altered the rules of engagement, forcing every capital to consider its next move with a degree of peril that hasn't been seen since the height of the Cold War confrontation. This is not just an isolated act of sabotage. It is a signal. This is the extraordinary and dangerous reality of the shadow war expanding directly onto NATO's eastern flank. The targeting of critical infrastructure, specifically a rail line essential for logistical movement and civilian transit, is the hallmark of Russia's hybrid playbook. It is designed to create paralyzing uncertainty, to force nations to allocate vast resources to internal security, and to prove that Moscow can strike deep behind the established front lines without ever crossing the conventional threshold of Article 5. We are seeing a deliberate strategy to degrade deterrence not through massed armored divisions, but through 1,000 cuts delivered in darkness. Historically, the rail line has always been the spine of military power. Think of the partisan campaigns of World War II, where disrupting logistics routes was often more critical than any single frontal assault. Moscow understands this inherent vulnerability perfectly. By hitting Polish rails, they are sending shock waves through every European capital that relies on seamless integration of energy, transport, and communication networks. The question now moves beyond attribution. It is about response. And the response from Warsaw has been swift, accusing Moscow not just of involvement, but of executing a deliberate strategy of destabilization targeting the EU. But Russia, sensing an opportunity to redirect scrutiny, immediately turned its anger directly toward the United States. Citing unnamed American intelligence sources and provocations, the Kremlin issued an unusually blunt threat, attempting to frame the escalating situation as a proxy battle orchestrated by Washington. The State Department didn't blink. Secretary Blinken, speaking behind closed doors and then releasing carefully worded, yet scathing readouts fired back. The diplomatic rhetoric has crossed a Rubicon. We are no longer discussing sanctions or humanitarian aid. We are discussing the intent behind deliberate acts of operational sabotage. Washington's clear message was that any attempt by Moscow to use this incident to justify expanding this conflict or attacking assets within NATO territory would meet a resolute response. This verbal sparring is the sound of conflict beginning to harden into posture. When high-level diplomats begin to speak in terms of retaliation, they are laying the groundwork for kinetic options. The stakes couldn't be higher. We must remember that just weeks ago, a specific, unidentified cyber attack severely degraded a high-value Russian military asset, causing what analysts assess to be meaningful operational damage. Whether this rail line attack is direct retaliation for that kinetic cyber strike remains unconfirmed. The timeline certainly suggests a retaliatory cycle is spinning rapidly out of control. Poland's President Duda stated clearly that the nation will not be intimidated, calling the attacks an act of state terrorism designed to sow internal chaos. This represents the raw force of political will needed to stand against the insidious nature of hybrid warfare. But defining the line is fraught with danger. NATO members are now agonizing over where the West draws the definitive red line against these deniable infrastructure attacks. If disrupting Polish rail is met only with strongly worded condemnations, what prevents Moscow from moving on to fiber optic cables or even energy grids in the next phase of this campaign? We are watching the situation move dangerously toward escalation. Intelligence sources tell us that NATO planners are already reviewing expanded retaliation options, meaning options that go beyond sanctions and move into areas of offensive cyber capabilities or even pre-positioning defensive systems further east. Moscow understands that its hybrid strategy relies on ambiguity. But if the ambiguity is stripped away by overwhelming, verifiable evidence, the West must have a response ready that is calibrated not merely to punish, but to deter. Because right now, the primary deterrence, the threat of overwhelming conventional response, is failing against the shadow operators who slip in, plant the charge, and vanish before dawn. The peril is immediate, and the world holds its breath, waiting to see which capital blinks first under the weight of this escalating geopolitical confrontation. This is a moment where diplomatic rhetoric has become the most dangerous precursor to kinetic action. The moment diplomatic rhetoric has become the most dangerous precursor to kinetic action. Moscow's immediate response to the Polish allegations has been predictable, yet its severity is extraordinary and dangerous. This isn't just a routine denial. It is the immediate full-spectrum activation of the Kremlin's global denial machine. A sophisticated operation designed not merely to refute the charge, but to bury the truth under an avalanche of counter-accusations. The Kremlin didn't blink. Instead of addressing Warsaw directly, Moscow immediately turned its anger directly toward the United States. They argue this entire incident, this rail line sabotage, is a Western provocation orchestrated by NATO intelligence elements, designed specifically to drag Russia into an unwanted, expanded confrontation on its borders. We are seeing diplomatic warfare being waged with the raw force of political will. This deliberate redirection of blame is not a sign of weakness or soft diplomacy. It's a strategy designed to make their denial harden into posture, shifting the battlefield instantly from the rail lines of Poland to the halls of the UN Security Council. When Russia fired back, the language used was chilling and devoid of diplomatic finesse. Foreign ministry officials issued statements sending shock waves across European capitals. They didn't just deny involvement. They issued an unusually blunt threat regarding what they perceive as targeted Western interference near sensitive infrastructure. Remember, this rail line incident follows reports of successful Ukrainian long-range strikes that achieved meaningful operational damage against a rumored high-value Russian military asset just last week. The linkage in Moscow's narrative is clear and unforgiving. Escalation begets severe retaliation. The situation is moving dangerously toward escalation with every hour that passes. The Kremlin is drawing a definite, albeit strategically vague, red line in the sand regarding military aid pathways that transit through NATO countries. They stated in no uncertain terms that Russia will not be intimidated. Their immediate messaging is a declaration that any further attempts at expanding this conflict through alleged sabotage or targeted strikes on strategic supply lines will be met with a resolute response. This is precisely the point where the informational war bleeds catastrophically into the potential for kinetic war. Moscow is preemptively justifying any future actions by simply labeling current NATO assistance as active acts of aggression. We are now seeing the immediate results of this escalating rhetoric. Intelligence analysts are scrutinizing leaked high-level documents, suggesting the immediate possibility of expanded retaliation options being developed in response to this perceived NATO aggression. These options move deliberately beyond the current conflict zone, focusing potentially on disrupting vital infrastructure far from the immediate front line. Infrastructure that NATO and the United States rely upon for global logistics and stability. This is no longer a measured game of geopolitical maneuvering. It's a terrifying test of wills played with live ammunition, where every accusation increases the risk of miscalculation. The danger is no longer theoretical. It is active, volatile, and driven by two nuclear-armed sides who refuse to yield ground. We are monitoring the immediate future because this confrontation may very well decide whether global stability takes a sudden, catastrophic plunge. This geopolitical drama is intensifying by the minute, and the world must understand that the next diplomatic word spoken may be the direct trigger for the first kinetic action. The moment the dust settled on the Polish rail line, the atmosphere in Brussels became extraordinarily and dangerous. NATO headquarters immediately convened emergency consultations under the shadow of potential Article 4 activation. This isn't just about sharing intelligence or verifying damage assessment. This is about gauging the raw force of political will necessary to confront an increasingly brazen campaign of suspected state-sponsored sabotage. The language used in these closed-door sessions, sources tell us, has begun to harden into posture, a diplomatic stance that is one misstep away from kinetic reality. The focus of this urgent NATO gathering is singular: how to define the operational threshold that justifies an alliance-wide response, and whether the destruction of infrastructure that supports the defense of Ukraine qualifies as a direct threat to the security of a member state. If the answer is yes, we move instantly into a new paradigm of confrontation. But the most alarming development occurred outside of Brussels, when Moscow abruptly turned its anger directly toward the United States. In a stunning, unscheduled press conference, Russia's foreign ministry accused Washington and its proxies of tacitly approving what they termed terrorist acts against vital European infrastructure designed to facilitate aid flow to Ukraine. This wasn't a standard diplomatic rebuke. It was a vicious escalation, delivered with icy precision. They delivered an unusually blunt threat, warning that any further targeting of Russian supply lines, even those that run near but outside of the recognized conflict zones, would be met with severe consequences that fundamentally run the risk of expanding this conflict regionally and globally. Washington didn't blink. The Secretary of State fired back within hours, dismissing the Russian accusations as desperate propaganda and confirming unequivocally that the alliance will not be intimidated by what is clearly a calculated campaign of fear and destabilization. The U.S. response was a resolute response, clarifying that NATO views attacks on sovereign infrastructure as potential acts of war, regardless of the hazy attribution or cynical pretext Russia attempts to establish. This high-stakes verbal volley is actively pushing the global situation dangerously toward escalation. The entire exchange has generated shock waves that are radiating outward, affecting global markets and military commands alike. Diplomatic channels are now jammed with frantic back-and-forth communication, all centered on finding the rhetorical red line that defines acceptable aggression short of outright invasion. Russia, in turn, is using the Polish incident to justify massive, rapid military maneuvers near the NATO border, claiming these are essential defensive steps to protect what they classify as a high-value Russian military asset, their entire logistics network supporting operations far beyond their current borders. We are hearing deeply disturbing whispers that NATO strategists are currently assessing expanded retaliation options, contingency plans that go far beyond economic sanctions, and involve asymmetric responses designed specifically to inflict meaningful operational damage should Russia cross the threshold from sabotage to outright invasion of a NATO member. This is not saber-rattling. This is the calculation of strategic advantage in a high-intensity, peer-level confrontation. The calculus of Article 4 activation, a consultation mechanism used when a member's security or independence is threatened, has never been so acute, so immediate, or so potentially consequential. This diplomatic dance unfolding across the capitals of the world is lethal. Every carefully chosen word, every denial, every threat issued from Moscow or Washington is not just noise. It is strategic positioning, an act designed to provoke or to deter physical violence. We are watching the pre-kinetic phase unfold in real time. The urgency cannot be overstated. The stage is set. The emergency consultations continue right now, trying to determine if the explosion on a few kilometers of rail line is proof enough that war has already begun. The answer unfolding tonight is that the confrontation has already begun, not with missiles, but with accusations so venomous, they are themselves weapons of mass geopolitical destruction. We are witnessing the instantaneous construction of the Iron Curtain 2.0. This is not a metaphor. This is an operational reality. Poland's initial, highly detailed intelligence brief pointing directly to Moscow, a document so explosive it was only circulated among NATO's highest echelon, has kicked off an extraordinary and dangerous cycle of escalation that shows no signs of decelerating. The immediate military response is underway. Polish units along the border are moving to heightened readiness. We are confirming reports of rapid deployment forces being activated in Germany and the UK, signaling a desperate scramble to solidify and secure the eastern frontier. The diplomatic temperature has rocketed past boiling. Moscow, instead of offering a nuanced denial of the sabotage against the Polish rail line, has instead turned its anger directly toward the United States, accusing Washington of not only orchestrating the disruption, but of actively seeking to draw Europe into a generalized war. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson didn't blink. They accused the White House of sponsoring terror within NATO territory. This isn't back and forth. This is geopolitical mortar fire. The State Department immediately fired back, calling the Russian statement a desperate and deliberate fabrication designed to distract from proven culpability. The language is no longer the language of diplomacy. It is the raw force of political will applied to the international stage, ready to harden into posture. Every diplomatic slight, every accusation, is pushing dangerously toward escalation. Defense analysts are warning that the shock waves from this Polish rail incident could ripple out across the entire theater of conflict. Why? Because the rail line in question is a critical logistical artery for moving Western material, ammunition, armored vehicles, complex air defense components toward the Ukrainian front. Disrupting this line constitutes meaningful operational damage to the collective defense effort. Moscow has now rhetorically established a dangerous, though unspoken, precedent. NATO supply lines on NATO soil are now legitimate targets. We are tracking an unusually blunt threat issued just hours ago from a senior Russian defense official. While denying involvement in the rail attack, he issued a warning about swift retaliation against any party attempting to destabilize core Russian strategic infrastructure. This rhetoric is a thinly veiled, but clear, attempt to establish a red line around their own high-value Russian military asset holdings in the Baltics and Kaliningrad. The message is chillingly clear. You hit our logistics, we hit yours. The Allied response has been equally uncompromising. The NATO Secretary General stated unequivocally that the alliance will not be intimidated by what he called Russian hybrid warfare tactics. He vowed a resolute response to any further attempts to violate or impede supply routes, suggesting that deterrence now requires far more than just verbal condemnation. Sources close to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe indicate that plans are already being drawn up for expanded retaliation options should the Kremlin attempt to disrupt another key logistical node, either by kinetic attack or further sabotage. The focus has entirely shifted to preventing this conflict from expanding this conflict into a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. But the very act of preparing expanded retaliation options suggests that the leaders believe that expansion is not just possible, but imminent. They are not planning for peace. They are planning for the next, inevitable phase of this confrontation. The question is no longer whether war has already begun, but how wide the blast radius will be when the next shoe drops. The world is holding its breath as the Iron Curtain 2.0 descends, colder and harder than the original.